Welcome to Radio Nebeshteh, Hannah Tinti.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Same. Hannah, would you please tell us a bit about your journey in world of the literature?
Oh gosh, my journey was, I think it probably began, my mother was a librarian. So from a young age, I was spending a lot of time around books. And so after school, she would still be working. I'd go there after school. I would wander around the stacks of books. Wow. And so it was a place I was always very comfortable with. And books became kind of a refuge and also a place that I found company, found friendships. And even though at school I was very interested in the sciences, so if you asked me if when I was 10 years old what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have told you Jacques Cousteau. I wanted to be out on a boat saving whales or something. But when I started studying and went to school for studying biology, I realized that well, I was very interested in the subject matter and loved science, and I still do. My talents really lay in literature. And so I switched majors and began studying writing and reading literature. So then after I graduated, I moved to New York City, where writers go, and decided to go to NYU, where you are now and where we met, which is really fun because then I went through that writing program as a student and then have now returned there as a teacher. And it's great to sort of have that cycle of returning to where I began. But my day job has always been working, besides teaching, in publishing. So I've worked at literary agencies and publishing companies, and I run a literary magazine called One Story. And then I've always worked on my own writing as well. So I've published 3 books, a collection of stories called Animal Crackers, a novel called The Good Thief, and a novel called The 12 Lives of Samuel Hawley.
Perfect. Let's go talk about the Good Thief. Yeah, thief.
The Good Thief, yes.
How did you research 19th century medicine in the Good Thief?
I did a lot of research, actually. So that book began when I was reading another book called Forgotten English, which is actually about words that have fallen out of usage in the English language. So words that used to be used but aren't used anymore. And one of these phrases was resurrection men. And I heard that word and I was like, resurrection men, that sounds very beautiful. I wonder who these men were, resurrection men. And then I read the definition and was horrified because they were these men who would dig up bodies and sell them to medical schools. So what they were doing was probably the worst thing imaginable, desecrating a grave. But ultimately what they did led to a greater good because the doctors needed bodies to practice on in order to save lives. So I've always been really drawn to morally complicated and murky areas like this. I immediately started thinking about a scene in my mind, and I was like, well, okay, if I'm going to write about these people, what would I need? I was like, okay, it's got to be a graveyard, right? I just came up with a scene. It's a graveyard. They need probably a horse and carriage. They need some shovels. Then they probably need a lookout, right? A lookout. And I decided that lookout would be a young boy. And then I just started writing a scene. And that ended up being a part of the book in the end. And so that's sort of how I usually have an image or an idea that I want to write about. I start writing a scene, and then the story starts building itself around, the original idea. As I was writing about this boy who was being the lookout for the grave robbers, I was just trying to write where he was standing, how he felt, what he was touching, what he was smelling, what he was tasting, what he was hearing. And so I decided with one of his hands he was holding onto the reins of the horse with the wagon for the bodies, and I was like, what is he doing with his other hand? And I was like, oh, he's scratching his chin. And I was like, no, that's not right. Oh, he's picking his nose. No, that's not right. And then he's got his hand in his pocket. No, that's not right. And I was like, oh, why can't I figure out what he's doing with his other hand? And I was like, oh, it's because he doesn't have another hand. Like, this is the answer that came to me in a revelatory moment. And then I was like, oh, how did he lose his hand? I'm asking myself as the writer, creating this thing. And then I was like, oh, that's the story I'm going to tell. How this boy lost his hand. That's going to be part of the story about what happened to him and how he ended up with these grave robbers, because this is a very dangerous place to be. So then that scene actually fell in the middle of the book. It's actually chapter 15, and then I had to almost go backwards and write how he got there in the first place. So first I wrote that scene where they're in the graveyard and they dig up a man who's still alive. That was Dolly in the book. So I wrote that scene, and then I went backwards and wrote from the orphanage to that scene, and then I wrote the end. So I wrote the middle of the book first, then the beginning, and then the end. So yeah, it's set in sort of a make-believe time. I didn't want to set it in the exact year because of I didn't want to have to stick too closely to any historical part. But I did do quite a lot of research. I went to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which is a museum of medical. It's attached to the medical school there, and they have a lot of history of medical colleges and research. And then I read a number of books, also about this. Yeah.
Which author inspired you to write crime fiction in the Motif?
For this book, I very much modeled it on Charles Dickens. I love Charles Dickens.
Which book?
Oh, all of them. I mean, but probably my favorite is Great Expectations. I think Great Expectations has one of the best first chapters of any book. And it actually is a very similar scene to what I wrote in The Good Thief. So the first scene in Great Expectations is Pip in a graveyard, visiting the graves of his parents. And he meets Magwitch, who is an escaped convict, who then grabs the boy and shakes him upside down just to rob him. And they end up becoming, so he's a very scary fellow, but he forces the boy to become friends with him. And that's how Great Expectations begins. And so in some ways, this was a reimagining of that, with Wren becoming friends with Dolly, with a very frightening, character who ends up saving him in the end. And a similar thing does happen in Great Expectations. So I was very much thinking about them in terms of style.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Let's talk about 12 Lives of the Samuel Hawley. Why 12?
So there was a number of reasons why. One of them is I was modeling the story somewhat on the 12 Labors of Hercules, the Greek myth. And one of them I was actually, because of a clock face with the 12 hours, because time is very important in the book. And also the other connection was the signs of the zodiac, so 12 signs of the zodiac. So the number 12 is actually, if you think about it, it's like the number 3 is an important number. Number 7 is a very important number in terms of balance. There is actually some sort of magic, I think, around the number 12. And so it was, that was why I landed on that number. It was also, the book is about a man who gets shot 12 times. And what I wanted to do for that is the conceit of the book. It began also similarly with that I did with The Good Thief, which is I wanted to write about a particular thing, which is a real contest that happens every year in Gloucester, Massachusetts, called the Greasy Pole Contest. So there is this pole that is about the length of like a telephone pole. It's put out over a town pier, set out over the water, and then every year during this festival, which is it's hosted by all the fishermen. This is a fishing village, and everybody earns their living catching fish. And it started as sort of, this festival was sort of a protection that they would do at the beginning of the season to hopefully, they would have all these celebrations, and then they would bring a priest to bless all of the fishing boats with this idea that hopefully no one will drown that year going out and fishing. And so one of this thing was they take this big telephone pole, They cover it with grease and lard. They nail a flag to the end, and then all the fishermen get very drunk. And then one by one, they try to walk this pole and grab a flag nailed to the end of the pole. And everyone goes out to watch it every year. And as a child, I would also go out and watch this. This town is, I grew up in Salem, Massachusetts. This town is maybe 20 minutes away, not too far. And I would watch these men every year compete in this contest. And some of them is quite violent almost, because they slip and fall and they knock their teeth out or maybe break an arm, fall into the water. But it's also very entertaining to watch because they're just slipping and sliding all over this thing. And I had asked myself the question: if you were going to write about something that no one was ever going to see, what would you want? What are one of the things that you would want to write about? And I thought, I'd want to write about this crazy greasy pole contest that I watch every year. There's something about it that's about masculinity and I don't know, the protection because of this sort of feeling of death that's looming over all these fishermen. They lead these very dangerous lives, and that there's fun and there's community to it, and it's very strange. So I was just, again, similarly, as I said, with another situation where I was just thinking, what would I need if I was going to write a scene about this? So I'm writing about one of the men who's going on to the pole, and it's almost his turn to try to walk the pole. And I physically was describing his body, and I sort of put my glasses, my binoculars on, I said, looking close, and was trying to, again, thinking about what he's smelling, what he's tasting, what he's touching. And I decided that his body has scars on it as a way to sort of describe him. And I was like, well, what kind of scars? I asked myself the question. And I looked a little bit closer, and I was like, oh, it's a bullet wound, actually, scar. He's been shot before. And I was like, oh, my God, and there's another one, and there's another one. And I was like, this man's been shot many times. So he's actually comes from a very dangerous background. Why is he going on this pole? He has nothing to prove about his masculinity. He's probably a criminal. And then I looked into the crowd for an answer, and then I saw his daughter was in the crowd, and I was like, oh, he's walking on this pole because of his daughter. And so then I had to build the whole story out of that. That's all I started with. And as I was thinking about the scars that we carry on our bodies, and how oftentimes scars are things every scar that we carry has a story attached to it. And,
actually, the Jorge Luis Borges.
Yes.
who is the focus on the scar too? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And there's this thing of these stories. Our scars, often the only people who really see our scars most of the time, unless it's on our face or something, is our doctors maybe and our lovers, people we might be very vulnerable to show our bodies to, and then maybe we'll share those stories of the scars. And I thought, what if I could try to tell a man's whole life story, so you only see bits and pieces, but you only get the stories of the scars. So you only find out these violent, these things that happen to him, and somehow piecemeal his life together. And that was the idea. And then I set myself the number 12, partly because I had this idea, well, it's sort of like Hercules having all these crazy labors, these things he had to do. So that was partly, it was also a challenge. Like, could I do this in 12 episodes? And then interweaving that is the present storyline of this man and his daughter. So it was a complicated structure, a storytelling structure to do for sure, but it was really fun. That's a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's fine. We can see it has an open ending on it, yeah?
You asked me why there's an open ending for the end, right, of 12 Lives of Samuel Hawley. And I think that I wanted, it's funny, when I give a reading or when I speak to people about the book, sometimes and there'll be a crowd, and I'll be like, how many people think that Samuel Hawley is dead? And then some raise their hand. And how many people you think he's alive? And then
I wish he's alive.
and then they raise their hand, and I'm like, okay, that determines whether or not this crowd is optimists or pessimists. Whether how many people in this group are more hopeful or maybe more negative. And so I guess I like having a little bit of an open end because I think that stories, I was just reading a piece by Julia Alvarez where she talks about her writing commandments, and one of the things she talks about is that stories are not answers, stories are questions. And I like that idea that it's about questioning, this idea of who we are and how are we human beings on this earth. And I like leaving a little bit of room open for the reader to kind of put themselves in there and make up their own mind. If they are an optimist, they'll think one way. If they are, more of a realist, say, not pessimist, let's say realist, they might think that, that he has passed. But in my mind, I think I was leaning more towards his time is, the end of, when Hercules died, at the end of his life, the gods took pity on him because he'd had a very difficult life, and they sort of raised him up and turned him into a constellation in the stars. So that was sort of my thinking, that he had now he was, the hero of the book is him, even though he's a criminal. And at the end of the book, I felt like he was turning things over to his daughter. Now it's her turn to be the hero.
Perfect.
Yeah.
How do you know all of the information about gun?
Yeah, the 12 Lives of Samuel Hawley has a lot of guns in it. It's interesting because I was talking to some people about this last night, and I think that if I wrote the book today, I might write it differently, because when I was working on this book, there's always been a gun problem in America, but in the past 10 years, now there are so many mass shootings and so many terrible things are happening with guns. I think I might shift the focus of the book a little bit, but when I started working on it, this was not as big of an issue in America as it is now. And so what I had to do, because I do not know anything about guns, I did not start in a place of knowledge there, I had to get some training. And because I was writing from the point of view of a criminal, and I needed to make all of those parts believable. So I went to this place called Westside Rifle Range in New York City, where you can get a background check, and they'll teach you how to shoot a very basic .22 caliber rifle. Then I also went to another gun range outside of New York City, where I met a gun enthusiast, and he showed me all these other kinds of weapons and how to use them. Then I also spoke to family members who are members of the military, so to make sure that I was getting everything correct. And then another friend of mine who is a writer who also, he read the book for me from start to finish and helped me just make sure I didn't make any mistakes. Because when you're writing about something and you're trying to trick everyone thinking that you know what you're talking about, it's really hard. But I feel like I still, I'm sure, made some mistakes, but I also, when I usually would go on tour and talk about the book, always people would ask me what kind of gun I had. And I'd have to tell them I own no guns. And then they said, when did your father get out of jail? And I'd say, my father collects stamps. My father is not a criminal. he collects stamps, and that's the kind of person my father is. He reads books and he collects stamps. So that, I feel like I did a successful job as a writer, that I convinced them that I own guns, that my father is a criminal. I think that's kind of fun when that happens, right?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Is it possible to tell us what is your next book topic?
I'm not sure what my next book will be. I have been playing around with two books. Well, actually, probably 3 books. So I'm not sure where I'm going to land. 3 projects. One is a collection of short stories, because I've written a bunch of short stories that feature, I'm calling it Danger Girls, because it's just girls getting in trouble in various ways, but very powerful, strong girls. And then I'm also been working on a book that's actually a craft book, sort of taking some of my teaching. I've been teaching now for quite a long time, and there's a lot of techniques that I use that are very different than what other people are doing. So my students, are very enthusiastic and want more material from me, and so I thought what I would do is try to take some of these exercises and lectures, some of which I've shared with you before, and try to put them into one volume. So if you haven't taken this class with me, you could learn a little bit about me. I'm going to call it Team Tinti.
Yeah.
Because that's what I call all of my students. They become part of my team, and now there's like this giant network of Team Tinti people. So, but the other project that I'm working on, which is really fun, is an interactive fiction. So interactive fiction is something that is a cross between literature and gaming. So it is something that is done virtually, and it's a little bit more complicated than working with hypertext. But the way I usually describe it is, if you remember, have you ever experienced those books called Choose Your Own Adventure?
No.
Okay, so these are books where you would read, they were very popular in the United States when I was a little kid, and you open the book and you read 10 pages, and then you hit a certain part and it says, okay, if you decide to, you're on this adventure and you're walking down the street and then you come to a cave, do you go inside the cave or do you continue along the road? And if you continue on the road, go, just turn the page. If you want to go into the cave, go to page 62, and you'll go to another page in the book. So you choose to go into the cave, you go to page 62, and then you keep reading, and then it gives you another choice, and then another choice. So the books are actually, they're physical books, but it allows you to almost make your own story out of the story, and it'll have a different ending depending on the different choices that you make. So this is something that people have been playing around with, and make it more like a video game kind of, but it's literature, it's only text. Although you can add sounds and you can add images and you can make it, sort of interactive in different ways. So that's something that I've been playing around with, and what I've been doing is translating my take on various fairy tales or folk tales that I grew up with, and my idea was to make a sort of digital short story collection that is fairy tales, but they're all like games that you play. It's very strange. So I don't know. I keep saying to my agent, I was like, it's something in between poetry, performance art, and gaming and reading. So I don't know what it's going to be in the end. I'll probably make zero money from it. That's basically what my agent doesn't like, but we'll see. Okay. Yeah.
We usually have a game in the Radio Nebeshteh.
Yeah.
I'm telling the one word, and you can tell us the short sentence about it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. E.L. Doctorow, Ragtime.
Yes. E.L. Doctorow is a fantastic writer, and he was my thesis advisor. He was my teacher when I was at NYU. And he really influenced me a lot. He was so smart, and he's an amazing writer, mainly because what I admire so much is he is able to write about real historical figures, but make you care about them as characters. And I often use his books when I teach craft classes at NYU. I always use his books as examples, like Ragtime I've taught, and Billy Bathgate is also one of my favorites of his books. And I think that's another book that has almost a perfect first chapter, one of the most perfect first chapters I've ever read. So I admired him a great deal, and he was very kind to me and gave me great advice.
Perfect. 1001 Night.
Oh, wow. I think the first time that I read this or was exposed to it was when I was a child. Had the books, had it read to me as a young child, and just completely captured my imagination in so many ways. And I have so many memories of all the details of the different stories. But I think the thing that stays with my mind the most is this idea of, the storyteller, of Scheherazade, and how this is such a powerful thing, is the power of the storyteller to bring your audience along and to change their minds about things. If you tell a compelling story, if you tell it well enough, you can change people's hearts. And I think this is what is so beautiful, about that book.
New York.
New York. New York is my second home. I grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, which is very well known in America as being a place of witches. In the 1600s, there was a very famous witch trials that happened there, and they killed many people thinking that they were witches. And now it is a sort of a tourist attraction, and it is sort of like, I always say to people, they ask me what it's like to grow up there, and I tell them, it's like being in Halloween, but 365 days a year. There's always people dressed up and costumes and people in witch hats and, craziness happening all the time. And there's this sort of, this history of America. And then I moved to New York when I was very young. And to come to school, and what I loved about being here was, and I think most writers feel this way in one way or another, is one of the reasons why we become writers is because we are the people who notice things that maybe other people don't notice, and also because we kind of feel like outsiders, not quite belonging or fitting in anywhere. And it's one of the reasons why I love books, and it's one of the reasons why I think I became a writer. So what I do remember when I first moved to New York was this feeling of like, oh my God, I actually fit in here because everyone's so weird. It's so
true.
Weird. Everyone's so strange. You just have the mix of people, and I'd walk down the street and I'd hear like 15 different languages, and then and everything's so wild. There was something about the chaos and it was the first place I think I ever felt that I wasn't different from everybody else.
Thank you so much, Hannah, Tinti, and we are really honored to you in the Radio Nebeshteh. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
It was my absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me. This was a delight to spend time with you and chat about these things. Thank you for asking me to come.
For sure.
Yeah.